So on Wednesday in Madagascar, when the light went out, people didn't just sit in the dark because they took to the street. And what started as a few angry posts on social media about power cuts, it completely blew up. We are talking about the deadliest protest the country has seen in more than a decade. 5 people were killed. The capital city went under curfew. But here's what makes this story so different from other protests you hear about in Africa. These weren't your typical political rallies. The youth in Madagascar, they borrowed a symbol from a Japanese anime, the skull and straw hat flag from One Piece, and they made it their battle cry. A battle cry against a government that literally can't keep the lights on. Within hours, Gen Z Madagascar was trending everywhere, and suddenly, you have kids who grew up on anime, holding pirate flags and facing down tear gas. The government's reaction, it was fast and it tells you everything you need to know. President Rajoelina, who was literally at the United Nations, bragging about Madagascar's energy future while his own country was rioting over Blackout, fired his energy minister the very next day. But was that just finding a scapegoat? Or is this crisis way deeper than just one guy? See, we are not just talking about a few power cuts. This is Madagascar. It's the world's 4th largest island country, home to about 33 million people, and only 1 out of every 3 of them has electricity. It's a country that speaks both Malagasy and French, which tells you a lot about its complicated colonial past. But unlike most of France's old colonies in Africa, Madagascar actually broke away from that whole CFA franc system. They control their own money. Still, their national utility company is bleeding $250 million a year. People are spending more time in the dark than in the light. This is a total infrastructure collapse happening on a massive scale, 400 kilometers off the coast of Africa. And it's a country where 3/4 of the people live below the poverty line. All while the president is jet-setting around the world, promising green energy revolution to guys like President Macron, who, by the way, just signed a huge energy deal with Madagascar just 5 months ago. In today's episode of Frontline Africa, we are going deep into the Lodele stage movement. That's Malagasy for fed up with load shedding. We are going to trace how a few angry Facebook posts turned into a nationwide uprising, why anime flags became the symbol of resistance, and most importantly, who's really to blame for turning Madagascar's youth into revolutionaries. Let's get into it. So, what do Japanese pirates have to do with African revolutionaries? A lot more than you think. And it's changing how young people everywhere are fighting back against power. Just picture it. The streets of Antananarivo, Madagascar's capital, are filled with smoke and tear gas. But the flags you see rising above that chaos, they aren't the usual political banners. It's the skull and straw hat from One Piece, a Japanese manga about a crew of pirates searching for freedom. And no, this wasn't random. This was a choice. The youth of Madagascar were deliberately connecting their own fight to this global story of resistance. The whole Lodele stage movement started pretty quickly, back in mid-September, just on Facebook. The name means fed up with load shedding, and it perfectly captured how everyone felt about the daily power cut, which could go on for 12 hours. It was started by 3 officials from the capital's local government. But what happened next caught everyone by surprise, because in just few days, the young people all over the island were sharing protest plans, memes, and that pirate flag. And this isn't just a Madagascar thing. We've seen Gen Z protesters in Nepal, Indonesia, the Philippines, all using the same anime symbol. That skull and straw hat stands for defying corrupt authority and fighting for your freedom. And those are themes that really hit home for young people everywhere who feel like they've been left behind. But in Madagascar, they even put traditional Malagasy hats on top of their One Piece flags. It was It was this perfect mix of a global symbol and their own local identity. The way they organized online was brilliant. Facebook was command central. And remember, 60% of the population is under 25. We are posting videos of police brutality, sharing real-time updates, and linking up with the Malagasy community in France, which is about 150,000 strong. These weren't just protests. They were full-on media campaigns that went around the old-school news channels to tell their own story. The movement worked because it knew how to turn pop culture into political power. When your own government has failed you, in a country where the average age is just 19, sometimes you have to borrow symbols from a fantasy world to start imagining a better reality. But while the youth were using symbols from fantasy, the crisis they were fighting was brutally real, and it had been building for decades right there in the dark. Can you imagine living in a country where having electricity is more of a long shot than having clean water? Where your president is on the world stage promising a renewable energy revolution where you can't even charge your own phone? That's Madagascar. Only 36% of the country has power, making it one of the most powerless places on the planet. And listen to these numbers. They are insane. The state-owned energy utility company loses about $250 million every single year. On top of that, it's already $400 million in debt. That's almost 10% of the entire government's revenue, all going to prop up a company that can't even do its one job. In the capital, Antananarivo, people deal with an average of 6 hours of blackouts every single day. And if you go out into the rural areas, most of the people have never seen a light bulb in their own home. But here's the really cruel twist. Madagascar is rich in resources. The island has tons of potential for solar, rivers that are perfect for hydropower, and great wind. And yet, 83% of the people are still using firewood and charcoal for energy. That's already causing massive deforestation in some of the most unique forests in the world, wiping out species you can't find anywhere else. Now, unlike a lot of former French colonies, Madagascar isn't trapped in that CFA franc currency system. They have their own money, the Ariary currency, but having their own currency hasn't meant they have their own power. While these people live in the dark, President Rajoelina flies around the world making these grand promises. Just 5 months before the protest, he signed massive deals with French President Emmanuel Macron. We are talking about a $700 million investment from the French energy company for a new dam. The gap between these international promises and what people are living through every day couldn't be wider. The country's utility company's crisis isn't just about money. It's a symbol of everything that's broken in Madagascar's government. The service is terrible, so people don't pay their bills, which makes the service even worse. It's a vicious circle. And meanwhile, if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, you just have your own private generator. Electricity has become a luxury item for the rich. But the country's infrastructure didn't just collapse overnight. It was killed off slowly by a political class that just had other priorities. And nobody understood that better than the young people who grew up in the dark. When you grow up learning not to expect anything from your own government, you learn to do things yourself. In Madagascar, doing things yourself looked like organizing a full-blown revolution on Facebook. Think about the youth in Madagascar, the ones born after the year 2000. They grew up in a really unique situation. They had smartphones, but no reliable electricity to charge them. They had access to Instagram and TikTok, but they had to walk to an internet cafe to use them because there was no power at home. They would binge watch a show on Netflix during the few hours the power was on, and then cook dinner by the light of a kerosene lamp. What you get from that is a generation that is super savvy digitally, but completely cut off from basic services. About 60% of Madagascar's population is under 25 years old. That's almost 20 million young people who inherited a country where just expecting the lights to turn on was seen as naive. They learned how to walk around the constant blackout, how to live in a state of permanent crisis, but they also learned how to organize online, how to build their own networks that didn't rely on the government, and how to imagine a different future that their parents never could. They spoke both Malagasy and French, so they are able to connect what's happening on their street to global audience. The online organizing for this protest started weeks before anything happened. The 3 local officials who kicked off the Liodele stage movement, they weren't old-school politicians. They were young, frustrated technocrats who couldn't do their jobs. They used Facebook groups, Instagram stories, and TikTok videos to build momentum across the entire island. Social media became their political arena because all the traditional ones had completely failed them. This generation just have a different relationship with failure. Their parents might remember a time when things were better, when the state energy company actually worked. But today's youth, they have no memory of that. For them, the government failing isn't a shock, it's just the starting point. So you end up with this mindset where they expect nothing from the system, but they demand everything. And then, on September 24th, the government made a huge mistake. They told these digital natives they weren't allowed to protest. The next day, the capital was on fire. September 25, 2025, at about 5:30 a.m. in the morning, the police are already out in force. By 10:45 a.m., the first tear gas is fired. By that evening, 5 people are dead and the capital city is under a curfew. Here's how a peaceful protest turned into a deadly uprising as it happened. The government had banned the protest the day before, but thousands of young people showed up anyways in Antananarivo, the country's capital. The plan was to meet in the center of the city, but by dawn, the police had already blocked off all the main areas. This forced the protesters to split up into smaller groups all across the capital. At 10:45 a.m., the police fired the first tear gas canisters. Immediately, social media just exploded. You had all these live streams showing clouds of smoke, young protesters speaking in Malagasy and French, giving real-time updates to their followers. But instead of running, the crowd just got bigger. They started setting up barricades with burning tires and rocks, turning major streets into battle zones. And you can tell what this was really about by looking at what they targeted. They didn't just attack random buildings. They went after the buildings that represented the government's messed up priorities. The brand new cable car system, a flashy project that cost millions while people didn't have power. That became a major target. They burned or damaged stations after stations. The message was crystal clear. Stop building toys for tourists when your own people can't even turn on a light bulb. Homes of politicians were attacked too. 3 houses belonging to officials close to President Rajoelina were set on fire. This was different from past protests. This was personal. The violence wasn't just in the capital. It spread to other cities across the island. By nightfall, hospitals were confirming that at least 5 people had been killed, and the victims had gunshot wounds from AK-47s. That was proof that security forces had used live ammunition on their own citizens. But while all this was happening, while his capital was basically burning, President Rajoelina was 8,000 miles away in New York City, telling the world that Madagascar was an energy success story. The irony of it all was about to blow up in his face. Just try to imagine this. Your capital city is in flames because people are furious about power cuts, and you are at the United Nations bragging about how you are a leader in renewable energy. That's Andre Rajoelina for you, the guy who came to power in a revolution, only to have a revolution come for him. The timing was just unbelievably bad. On September 24th, while his government was banning protests back home, Rajoelina was giving a speech at the UN. He was trying to sell Madagascar as this model for green energy, promising investors a bright future. 24 hours later, his capital city was under a curfew. You couldn't make this stuff up. Rajoelina himself led a popular uprising back in 2009 that threw out the president at the time. He sold himself as the young guy who was going to fix Madagascar's broken system and bring prosperity. Now, 16 years later, he's the establishment and he's facing his own youth revolt. The contradictions are just staggering when you look at the history here. Again, Madagascar isn't like other former French colonies. They have their own currency, the Ariary currency. They broke free from French financial control way back after independence in 1960, after a really brutal colonial period. But even with that freedom, the country is still in a tough spot economically. And get this, just 5 months before the riot, Rajoelina was hosting French President Emmanuel Macron. It was the first time a French president had visited in 20 years. They signed deals for over $700 million, including a huge investment for a new dam. Macron promised this would completely transform Madagascar's energy situation. So while Rajoelina was telling world leaders about his plans for $4.5 billion in private energy investment, his own people were rioting because they couldn't even get the light to stay on. The disconnect between the promises and the reality had never been so clear, and you could see the writing on the wall. In his last election in 2023, less than half of the people even bothered to vote because the main opposition parties boycotted it. The Digitized movement wasn't just a threat to his power at home. It threatened to expose his entire international image as a fraud. He was facing the biggest crisis of his presidency, and he had about 24 hours to figure out what to do. And his next move will tell you everything about how today's leaders choose between taking responsibility and just trying to survive. The government had a choice: fix decades of problems or find someone to blame. They found one person to blame, because on September 26th, exactly one day after the violence, President Rajoelina fired his energy minister. No real explanation was given other than just saying he understood people were frustrated with the power crisis. It was a classic political move, right? The oldest trick in the book. You get rid of the guy who is the face of the problem, but you don't touch the broken system underneath. The energy minister basically became the sacrificial lamb for decades of problems. The state energy company's massive debt didn't start with him. The power grid was already falling apart years before he got the job. But when your capital is burning, somebody has to take the fall, and the minister is always more disposable than a president. The rest of the government response was straight out of the standard authoritarian playbook. They imposed curfews in all the major cities to control people's movement. They arrested social media influencers to try and shut down the online organizing. Basically, they made a few symbolic gestures while avoiding any of the real structural changes that are needed. What's interesting, though, is Madagascar's unique position. Since they aren't tied to the CFA franc system, you think they would have more freedom to handle things differently. And with Macron's big investment promises, you would think France might have something to say. But the international community was completely silent, because previous crises in Madagascar, you probably hear from institutions like the African Union or other African governments. But this time, nothing at all. Even France, who had just signed those huge deals, said absolutely nothing about the unrest. And if you look at who they arrested, it tells you what the government was really scared of. They went after the well-known social media influencers. That shows you they knew these digital platforms were the new political battlefield. The movement had completely bypassed all the old ways of doing things. But at the end of the day, firing one minister doesn't fix a financial collapse. Curfews don't turn the power back on, and those French investment deals don't mean anything if electricity never reaches the people. The leaders were busy playing their political games, but a much bigger question was hanging in the air. Was this just the beginning? Because all across Africa, a new generation is rising, and they are not playing by the old rules. So the immediate violence in Madagascar has died down for now, but the revolution they kicked off, that's just getting started. Because the streets of Antananarivo might be quiet today, with residents sweeping up glass and assessing the damage, but the digital networks that sparked this uprising are still running. The movement showed us something completely new. This was a digitally native uprising that didn't need traditional political structures. It wasn't organized by opposition parties or civil society groups. It was a raw, youth-driven explosion of anger, organized entirely on social media by young people who move seamlessly between their local Malagasy reality and the global digital world. The curfew that's in effect across 5 cities tells you everything. The government knows this is a temporary quiet, not a permanent solution. They fired the energy minister, closed schools, and extended restrictions because they understand the underlying fury hasn't gone anywhere. The state energy company is still bleeding money. The power cuts are still happening, and 20 million young Madagascans are still charging their phones at public stations. That organizational model can be replicated anywhere young people have smartphones and grievances. The same conditions exist across Africa. Nigeria's power grid collapses almost every week. South Africa has rolling blackouts. Kenya's youth face mass unemployment despite economic growth. Though the specific triggers might be different, but that deep frustration with governments that promise everything and deliver nothing, that's universal. Madagascar's unique position outside the CFA France zone, geographically isolated, fresh off major French investment deals, should have provided more stability. Instead, this crisis revealed that none of those advantages matter when basic governance fails. That's a lesson that echoes far beyond this Indian Ocean island. Climate change adds deadly urgency to these dynamics. As the fifth most climate vulnerable country globally, Madagascar's infrastructure will only get more fragile. Resource stress will create more Leodestate movement, not just here, but across the continent. The international community needs to face reality. When young people burn infrastructure over power cuts, your development programs and foreign investment pledges have failed. People need electricity in their homes before they need democracy workshops. Back in Madagascar, the lights are still off. The underlying problems remain untouched, and a generation that grew up in darkness has decided they are done waiting patiently. The only question now is, who's next? Now, if you have watched to this point, this is Frontline Africa, where we talk about geopolitics from Africa's own point of view, where we bring the stories that mainstream media does everything to avoid. Now, if you are in Madagascar, do us a favor. Go to the comment section and drop a comment. Tell us the reality on ground. Tell us exactly what is happening right now so that we can help you echo your grievances so that the whole world will know what is happening in your country. And if you want to see more of my videos, maybe consider to subscribe and turn on those notifications. I am your host, Ezekiel Enejeta, and I will see you in the next one. It's a bye-bye for now.